So then, we are back with more understandings on the time of the Second Tabernacle services. We refined in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then, we can understand the time of the end as per Yirmiyahu the prophet. We find a layer of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. So then, as we read Yirmiyahu, then the evaluation comes as a structure. Then from the writings of Yirmiyahu then comes ramifications where you can consider sections of Yirmiyahu the prophet being very compacted, then explained further as pieces and sections of Yirmiyahu was explained then. Daniel, for instance, Ezekiel, sections of Yirmiyahu, you find pieces then related directly with the writings of Yirmiyahu the prophet. As we are studying during this time Daniel, it's extremely important for us then taking the time and understanding then the linker. Very amazingly, yesterday we've discovered regarding then the importance of Daniel's work and the way he was involved when he was then doing his work for the king Darius the Mede. As we read then Daniel the 11th chapter, you find very precisely what Daniel was explaining as far as the restoration period. And then Daniel the 12th chapter, as he explains then not truly the knowledge, but then the content and the context of what Daniel has said is regarding the velocity of the transactions. Daniel was a person doing trade on behalf of the king. He was then an expert regarding the time of the trade amongst the nations, and then Babylon was the very center of trade of his time. As we understand similarly, when 1,000 years without the holy cities then started, you find then the center of trade of the world was then obviously England, and then later became United States. So then, when we read Daniel, the simple fact is, let's say the English pound was known every place in the world, mostly. Later became the USD. Daniel was the linker of his time. As we understand, for instance, the paperwork involved during the time of Daniel and the monetary system of his time, Daniel himself was the linker from Babylon and other nations. He had his own system. As he was developing further other types of monetary system and including from other nations, this system integrated in his own, obviously regarding his own on behalf of Babylon, with obviously the okay from the king. He was then multiplying the resources, and then he became himself very prosperous. His prosperity as far as a system was then copied later. When the Messiah came and completed the spring feast, he then prepared his people for tabernacling. Outside of the holy cities, as they were giving directives, they were precisely what Daniel had done previously. You find then Daniel understanding Ishmael, the first son, and then tabernacling, obviously he did understand also. Then you find later than the 1,000 years of the Messiah, precisely using those methods. And then you find 1,000 years without the holy cities. And then we are in the time of restoration. Then we are rescuing of what Daniel started, because we are dealing mostly with the system of the Gentiles. So then when we read the 12th chapter of Daniel and he explains as knowledge, it's not truly the knowledge of it. It is the trade, and the trade doing it very fast. So then, what can we understand as far as the future? You can be sure of it. Be very focused regarding then the velocity system of the trade. This means, for instance, there are a few countries in the world dealing with transactions with the signal of the internet system using as 100 megabytes per second, for instance. It's a very fast way of making transactions. This was precisely what Daniel was mentioning. So the knowledge he was explaining himself, and also simultaneously linking, or the linker was Daniel and his system, spoken of via Daniel the 12th chapter. You can be sure of it. You can study the holy word of the Hebrew regarding then trade and fast with the content regarding trade. You will find what Daniel was explaining was what he was doing, but on a much faster pace. So then, as far as the linker, Daniel was then linking up nations around him near Babylon and nations far away from Babylon. Daniel had developed the existing system, but he made very profitable. He received wisdom, and he then used the wisdom so other nations would link themselves with Babylon. As we understand, the 800 years of England was also a linker. Then the couple hundred years of America was then the linker. As you find the linker of the time, then linking up the other nations. China then is becoming more and more prominent. However, you find then the system being mostly used with USD. The only situation and the distinction of these is then vengeance itself. There is a preparation of a nation being the despised one, and then the nations making the design of the time of the restoration period as far as the Gentiles. Thus then you find the base of the statue of Daniel. Then you find this despised one yet wilt become then wealthy later. So the only way you can make a despised one and then later becoming wealthy, if you understand then a linking system. As Daniel was the linker of his time, so then England was the linker of its time, then you find then USD being a linker of this time. The only situation is the pound, the English pound, is yet very powerful yet. But then because of the situation regarding then USD, and then the nation being the despised one of the time because they want to prolong further than 1,000 years, then yet this despised one, because of the linking, will to generate wealth later. So then, truly Daniel the prophet, he was explaining then areas of knowledge, but not related with regular knowledge. It was related directly of his work environment as the most important trade linker the world was ever experienced, because precisely the system he was involved with was then used by the Messiah himself. He was directing then the nations of what Daniel had done before. As we understand, we read then the completion of the spring feast and post-spring feast, then the foundation of the apostles and prophets, isn't it? The foundation of the Shilishim and the prophets. The Messiah being himself a prophet, he would point of what the prophets had said. As Daniel then explained, and he was the linker of his time, so obviously the Messiah would point to them of what he did, because the wisdom received was already in practice. The Messiah did not come up with a system of his own. He used of what was available. So then you find reflections of times and the seasons. It's not related with then the instructions and the shadow prophetic events. Those are other situations. Those are related with tabernacling. Those are not the same as the Gentile level. So then, as we then in the future, as we watch then technology related with trade, we are not speaking, for instance, of games and nonsense junk, gadgets and electronic junk. It is directly, precisely what Daniel was involved with. And his involvement was precisely trade. While he was doing then by hand, and he had obviously a very huge team working for him. As you go to work every day, for instance in a bank, and you have sometimes dozens of people working and doing paperwork and answering questions and taking care of notes and credit and so on and so forth, so did Daniel. If you would be watching Daniel doing the work today, it would be very similar to the work of a bank. The only distinction is the velocity of the entire system. So the objective of this time is then watching transactions being done very fast. That's what we can expect from the future. As far as electronic junk and gadgets and so forth, it's got nothing to do with knowledge. Not in spite of what then the instructions are instructing us. from a Gentile viewpoint, other than the instructions, it is a form of knowledge. But we are not interested in secular junk. We want what Daniel had experienced, so then we have then a path for the future. Then yesterday, a very important piece of news besides the cable regarding then Brazil starting up, then laying down of cable uniting then Brazil with Portugal, starting then the work in July of this year. You find then a very important piece of information regarding then the Chinese monetary system. The Reserve Bank of Australia, very reliable as far as we understand as information is concerned, has told the then delegates of the Center for International Finance and Regulation, there was a conference in Sydney, that the internationalization of China's monetary system, the yuan, and the changes taking place will be then obviously worldwide. So then it's already showing a very strong link with this and Daniel the 12th chapter. But not only this, the existing USD must be linked with Daniel 11 as far as then the despised one as United States, but then later, because of the linking of this system, then becoming wealthy later. We must unite those layers so then we understand why. That our nations are absolutely 100% dependent upon USD. But then the USD is the second beast of Revelation. Not only this, you find then this system of USD becoming wealthy later. So those areas must be linked up. Firstly, because first and second beast is directly related with the Gentiles. Explains only couple of periods of time other than the holy cities. So gives you a chance of then dividing the time properly. Times and the seasons. There was a time for 1,000 years of the Messiah, and then 1,000 years with no cities. As we read this very important information, we understand then the banking system, they use very fast transaction computerized systems. So then a very important piece of information was given as we read further. You find then that the system that Daniel started is precisely what is returning. Sometimes it's not very easy understanding these, more so if you have no directives as far as dividing the time. Leviticus the 23rd chapter, for instance, divides then spring feast and autumn feast. And the Messiah, obviously, he was involved even further with it. As he explained then his 1,000 years of tabernacling, then from then on, the holy city simply pointed the people of what Daniel had done. because the understanding is the foundation of the apostles and prophets. So then, this shows us a great piece of this huge prophetic section of the events yet coming. And then, not only this, but then you find then the first holy city on the land of Cush, as per the instructions of the prophet. We find that then in this entire situation there is no religion. If you hear very cautiously, you don't find religion in it. You find pure facts. Nobody's asking you to bow down. Nobody's asking you to say your sins. Nobody asking you, so then you should do this, that, and the other. Nobody's giving you behavioral list. Nobody's criticizing if you have done this, that, and the other. You read the facts, you understand times and the seasons, you understand then Leviticus the 23rd chapter, the prophetic events coming from the time of Daniel and on until our day, and then pointing people back of what was explained. During the time of Daniel, himself as being the system linker with the other nations, later the Messiah coming, preparing then the people for his 1,000 years, and then the holy cities directing the Gentiles of what Daniel had done. Later on, we should have more of these specialized, very fast transactional system, as we then spend the time reading then the paper sometimes from One News of New Zealand. You find then the New Zealand monetary system this year is highly valued, and the system they use is extremely fast. New Zealand is then a set of a couple of islands, Northern Island and Southern Island, and they are very serious as far as doing trade with Asia. And obviously Asia was directed by Shaliach Shaul, and he pointed them obviously to what Daniel had done. In some way of some form, any kind of shilishim of the time, they always would then point people back what the prophets had done. Tabernacling firstly, but also other aspects of future trade system, because he knew of Ezekiel the 37th chapter. He knew at some point in the future there was unification of the first and second sons. As far as the Northern Kingdom, a person must never interfere of what's going on over there. There are no conversations with the West and the Northern Kingdom. So then, as we then spend the time and we read Daniel the 11th chapter, we are then starting placing those layers properly. Not yet perfectly, but it's coming. You find the designers of this time of the restoration period, the Gentile level, or then the second chapter of Daniel, the base of the statue, the nations being iron, the other nations being clay, and then the main designers: Kingdom of the North, Kingdom of the South, and Kingdom of the East. The leaders of the countries, for instance, the Northern Kingdom, Mr. Putin and Obama, they want to talk of some sort. From the enlightenment of the holy instructions, we don't have to go very far away to understand what's the outcome. But let's wait and verify what's going on. But the Northern Kingdom is not going to move an inch. Not this time. These places the United States in a more favorable position because as US, in a gradual understanding, they retrieve and rebuild, later they place themselves in a position of receiving the wealthy event of Daniel 11. Now, liking it or not. But since we understand the Holy Creator is always wise in what He does, then the best is reading the instructions and lining up with it. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.